Andreas, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, it's an enormous pleasure to be in front of you today. I'm very aware that we are the last panel before lunch, and we stand before you and some much-needed nourishment. And Andreas has been very kind to allow me to address you from the podium today. Normally, I would ad-lib my way through this sort of presentation, but this is such a serious subject, and it's becoming more topical every day. I thought that a few thoughts written down might be useful. So, ladies and gentlemen, as we all know, we are not a static species, and historically migration has always been a feature of our societies, but rarely, if ever, at this scale. So if you will forgive me a few statistics. According to the UNHCR, as of 6 months ago, there are 122 million forcibly displaced people in the world, more or less evenly split between women and men, but 40% are children. The number of internally displaced people is now 73 million, meaning that 60% of those forced to flee their homes never leave their own country. But of those that do, 67% stay in neighbouring countries, which are mostly low and middle income nations, which are themselves increasingly made more unstable by climate change and indebtedness. Worryingly, Zurich Re has forecast that the number of climate refugees may reach 1.2 billion by 2050, 10 times what it is now. A refugee stay in a camp averages 17 years. Consigning refugees to a state of limbo, robbed of hope for a future, is not only abhorrent, it also cultivates a cadre of deeply disaffected, angry, and frequently traumatized people. Fortunately, at last, there are schemes to give refugees electronic identities, providing verifiable digital credentials and giving access to employment, education, and banking, while also assisting host governments with reliable data and fraud prevention. It is important to remember at the start that migration has economic advantages for host countries. The addition of energy, knowledge, skills, and experiences are often of particular benefit. When migration is managed inclusively, it becomes a source of innovation, cultural exchange, and labour mobility, turning perceived disruption into an economic opportunity for both migrants and their host communities. However, one must also recognise that these advantages can easily be offset by cultural and political impacts that, unless managed wisely, can have far-reaching consequences. Given the gravity of the escalation of migration and its politicalization, one might be forgiven for asking why solutions that address the problems at source are not being sought, rather than weaponizing the political debate around the outcomes. And on the latter, I wonder in this difficult and now, sadly, perhaps dangerous world, if one is entirely wise to allow the winds of debate to tend towards demagoguery and to blow across the delicate balances of our democracies, fanning the fears and concerns of the disaffected and worried, and those already shaken by untethered chaos and disinformation. We may do better to heed the lessons of the past, but whilst accepting the responsibility of the present. We should stop treating politics as a game of chess, for now it is the chessboard itself that is under threat, and our survival is not mandatory. The drivers of migration and displacement are principally conflict, amplified by climate change and the loss of natural capital, and the attendant tribulations of food and water insecurity, starvation, drought, pest, and disease. We are overwhelmed with evidence that climate change and biodiversity loss are not political myths or scams, but real, tangible, measurable phenomena rooted in physics, chemistry, and biology. Every 1% increase in food insecurity leads to a 2% increase in migration, and most forcibly displaced people, 90% of all IDPs and 48% of all refugees and asylum seekers, are concentrated in countries suffering food crises. With 700 million hungry people in the world, we are not short of emerging catastrophes to cause further migrations. Water security is also a threat multiplier, with violence over water rising sharply. 347 incidents in 2023 alone, around 150% more than in 2022, in a decade-long growth trend. Most internal displacement events are caused by disasters. 90 million displaced people are living in conditions of high to extreme exposure to climate-related hazards, and nearly half of those forcibly displaced people are burdened by both conflict and the adverse impacts of climate change. Over the past 10 years, weather-related disasters have caused 222 million internal displacements, equivalent to approximately 60,000 displacements a day. As climate-related hazards increase in the coming decades, the risks for displaced people and their hosts will grow significantly. By 2040, the number of countries facing extreme climate-related hazards is set to rise from 3 to 65. The vast majority of which are already hosting displaced populations. Extreme heat will increase, with most refugee settlements and camps projected to experience twice as many days of dangerous heat by 2050. By the end of 2023, over 70% of refugees and asylum seekers came from highly climate-vulnerable countries that are the least able to improve their resilience, so jeopardizing the refugees' return home. Evidently, there is little peace about food and water security, and there is no food security without investment into regenerative, climate-resilient agriculture, landscape restoration, and water infrastructure. The UNHCR urges us to protect displaced people, include displaced peoples and their host communities' needs in climate finance and policy decisions, invest in climate resilience in fragile and conflicted affected settings, and reduce climate emissions. That, ladies and gentlemen, is not going as well as it might. Clausewitz might have recognized the zeitgeist that prioritizes protectionism over partnership, that confuses tactics for strategy, and that renames defense as war. But it is not reassuring. In a world order that allows us the freedom to pay homage for luxury of overstretched budgets and the calm of restive populations, we appear to be confronted by a stark, but I believe false choice, spending on military security versus spending on humanitarian and development needs. Most NATO countries have agreed to spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense. Currently, defense spending stands at about 2.4% and is set to rise to 5%, 3.5% on military expenditure, 1.5% on infrastructure. Recently, some have somewhat heretically suggested that part of the 1.5% could be used to support nature and climate programs targeted at the drivers of conflict and instability. Global military spending reached $2.7 trillion in 2024, and if it continues at this pace, will reach $6.4 trillion by 2035. And as we know, but perhaps may not have learned, from the generally ruinous interventions of the last 20 years, the massive influx of arms, and too often mercenaries, into already fragile zones tends to fuel further insurrection, migration, and displacement. The tide of weapons and proto-insurgents is a global phenomenon, created in the service of great power politics, which are far removed from the simple choice of subsistent survival versus 6 months' wages to join a rebel group. Inciting instability and chaos, murder and mayhem, ladies and gentlemen, is not unremunerative. Conversely, the majority of the OECD's DAC countries have committed 0.7% of the GNP to aid. This actually stands at 0.37% and is fast declining. The Global Humanitarian Overview for 2025 estimates that $45 billion is needed to assist 187 million people in 73 countries. Unfortunately, by the end of August, only 20% of that, $8.6 billion, has been raised. This means that for organizations like the WFP, it is a choice daily of who lives and who dies. Meager investment into building climate resilience and adaptation and the consequent reduction in employment and economic stability increases the chance of food and water insecurity and the probability of war, migration, and displacement. Under those circumstances, the $1 trillion of climate investment needed per year by 2030 for the emerging economies will not materialize, especially if it is anticipated to come from the private sector, whose appetite for high risk, low returns is curiously somewhat limited. The situation is compounded by the international debt crisis, which in 2024 saw 34 African countries spending more on their debt servicing than on education and health. This part of the poly crisis, despite efforts to form a borrowers' club and to reform the Paris Club's common framework, is still unresolved. However, by demonstrating the risk reduction capabilities of KPIs linked to building climate and environmental resilience, there is an unattainable virtuous circle of reducing risk and therefore the cost of capital, so increasing access to capital, thereby growing employment and fiscal headroom. Dealing with the debt crisis, maintaining ODA, and increasing FDI are not Keynesian luxuries that we can forego. Rather, they are critical necessities in building resilience against the chaos that we have unleashed. Stability can only be achieved by addressing the problems at source, rather than sheltering behind walls of exclusion, which, incidentally, do not last. It is resilience and economic stability that provide the security and ability to bring peace and reduce migration and displacement. We seem now to be in a political world characterized, perhaps as best defined by Edmund Burke's phrase of 1790, as the ethics of vanity. Whereas we move from enlightened to unenlightened self-interest, it appears laudable to weaken the institutions that have managed to protect us from ourselves. These institutions' principles are, of course, the hard-won pillars of our security that we seem to be so nonchalantly dismantling to stand triumphant among the ruins, inadequately succoured by the rather flimsy plurilateral arrangements we can cobble together as substitutes. Despite our budgetary difficulties, we must not abandon our support for the physical and social and legal infrastructure so essential to forge equity and trust. It is this trust, the real basis of peace, which underpins any effective sense of shared identity and nationhood, but which is itself built on good governance, education, and, critically, access by women and girls to education and the job market. It is the provision of funding, not the pledging of it, that builds trust between states. Similarly, trust will be badly eroded if the anticipated carbon or biodiversity credit dividend, focused as it did on supply rather than demand, proves illusory. Requiem in pacem, ladies and gentlemen, net zero, which is a pity, for we are running out of time. Last two quick points. A Scrabble word for you, velleity, a wish or inclination not strong enough to lead to action. And inaction is like the sibilant books of antiquity. The longer you delay the purchase, the higher the price you pay, and the less advantage you receive. Also, of course, our failure to maintain our investment into countries to build resilience merely provides a vacuum for others to fill, whose interests may well be inimical to the common good. History will judge us by how we determine our fate. As we look at the escalating threat of instability and conflict, surely there is an imperative to ensure that we are not complicit in the end of development, but rather that we foster peace by addressing climate change and nature loss, which are now the predominant drivers of insecurity, conflict, migration, and displacement, and that we do so with courage, speed, and compassion. For as Thucydides, a wise Athenian, the father of history, a general, said, peace cannot be kept by force, it can only be achieved by understanding. Thank you very much.